When the door clicked shut behind my mom, it echoed through the house, amplifying the silence. I stood there, my heart skipping a beat. We were alone. George was leaning casually against the doorway, his arms crossed. His gaze settled on me, steady and unreadable, like he was studying me in a way he never had before. "Scarlett," he said, his deep voice filling the quiet space. "Think you'll manage without your mom for a few days?" I forced a smile, trying to mask the sudden rush of nerves. "Of course, George. I'm not a little girl anymore." His lips curved slightly, and his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. "No, you're not," he replied, his tone almost thoughtful. And just like that, something shifted. For the first time, I noticed things about him I hadn't before: the sharp line of his jaw, the way his shirt fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, the streaks of silver in his hair that made him look distinguished, not old. I didn't know why, but I couldn't look away. Later that evening, I found myself lingering in front of the mirror, adjusting my hair, smoothing my shirt. It was ridiculous. I wasn't dressing up for him. Or was I? Shaking off the thought, I went downstairs. George was in the living room, stretched out on the couch with a book in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his eyes flicking over me briefly before returning to his page. "Everything okay?" he asked without looking up again. "Yeah," I replied, sitting on the armchair across from him. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of the clock ticking. I tried to focus on my phone, but my attention kept drifting back to him, how calm and collected he seemed, like nothing could rattle him. It was the kind of confidence you didn't see in boys my age. "Do you always read in silence like this?" I asked, breaking the stillness. He looked up, amused. "Should I play some music for you?" I laughed softly, feeling a warmth spread through me at the way he looked when he smiled. "No, I don't know. It's different." "What's different?" I said before I could stop myself. "You're not like other people." His expression shifted just slightly, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I guess that's a compliment," he said, closing his book and setting it aside. "But you're not like other people either, Scarlett." The next day, I found myself looking for excuses to be around him. I lingered in the kitchen while he cooked, asked him unnecessary questions, even volunteered to help him with yard work, something I'd never done before. "You're unusually helpful today," he said, glancing at me as I handed him the rake. "Just trying to earn my keep," I replied, shrugging. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You don't have to try so hard. You're doing just fine." It was a simple statement, but the way he said it made my stomach flutter. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to push things further. I wore a dress I'd never dared to wear before, a fitted one that hugged my waist and flared at the hips. When I walked into the dining room, George's eyes flicked to me, then back to the table. But I didn't miss the way his jaw tightened, or how his gaze lingered just a second too long. "New dress?" he asked, his voice calm but slightly deeper than usual. "Do you like it?" I asked, sitting down across from him. "It suits you," he said simply, reaching for his glass of water. The words were innocent, but the way he said them made my heart race. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word he'd said, every look he'd given me. Something was happening between us, I could feel it. I didn't know where it would lead, but one thing was certain: this was just the beginning. And trust me, what happens next will blow your mind. There was something about George the First hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just his quiet confidence or the way his deep voice seemed to fill the room, it was the way he carried himself, the way he spoke with authority, even in casual conversations with my mom. He had an air of maturity, of control, that none of the boys I knew could ever match. The more I thought about it, the more glaring the differences became. The boys I went to school with were clumsy and awkward, fumbling through life without direction. George, on the other hand, was sure of himself. Every word he said, every movement he made, it all felt deliberate, like he was always in control. I caught myself watching him more and more, noticing things I'd overlooked before, the way his shirt sleeves fit snugly around his arms when he rolled them up, the faint lines that appeared at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the way he'd lean back in his chair with that calm, confident demeanor. It was maddening, really. I shouldn't have been thinking about him like that. But I couldn't help it. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, I decided to test the waters. I put on a dress I'd recently bought, simple but fitted, hugging my waist in a way that highlighted my figure. I'd been too nervous to wear it before, but tonight felt like the right moment. When I walked into the dining room, George was already seated, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I entered, and for a brief moment, his gaze flicked over me. "That's a new dress," he said, his voice calm and steady. I hesitated, my heart racing. "Do you like it?" He smiled faintly, setting his phone down. "It suits you. You've got good taste." I sat down across from him, trying to act nonchalant, but my cheeks felt warm. His words were polite, innocent even, but the way he said them, the way his eyes lingered for just a second too long, it was enough to make my pulse quicken. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to him even more. I started spending more time downstairs, finding excuses to be near him. "Do you need help with that?" I asked one afternoon as he carried a box of groceries into the house. He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You're offering to help?" "That's a first." I shrugged, trying to look casual. "Just thought I'd be useful for once." He laughed softly, the sound deep and warm. "All right, if you insist. Just don't drop anything." I followed him into the kitchen, feeling an inexplicable thrill at the way he glanced at me over his shoulder. Another evening, we were sitting in the living room. Mom was working late again, leaving the house quiet and dimly lit. George was watching TV, but I couldn't focus on the screen. My attention kept drifting to him. "You've been quiet tonight," he said suddenly, glancing at me. "Just thinking," I replied, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "About what?" I hesitated. "Nothing important." He didn't push further, but the way he looked at me made me feel like he knew I wasn't telling the truth. Later that week, I found another excuse to linger near him. He was in the kitchen, fixing something under the sink, and I stood nearby, pretending to look for a snack. "You're spending a lot of time in here lately," he remarked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Maybe I just like the company," I said before I could think better of it. He paused, looking up at me. "Do you now?" I felt my cheeks flush. "I didn't mean it like that." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a funny one, Scarlett." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he smiled at me, the way he moved, the way his voice sent a strange warmth through me every time he spoke. This was ridiculous. He was my mom's husband, for God's sake. I shouldn't have been thinking about him like this. And yet, I couldn't stop. Something was building between us, something I couldn't quite name. And I had a feeling it was only going to get more intense from here. When Mom told me she'd be going on a work trip for a few days, I couldn't hide my excitement, not that she noticed. George would be staying home, and I couldn't help but see it as an opportunity. For what exactly, I wasn't sure yet, but I knew this was my chance to see how far I could push the boundaries. That first evening, I left my bedroom door open while I changed clothes. It wasn't intentional at first, but when I heard George's footsteps in the hallway, I decided to test him. As I slipped my shirt over my head, I saw him out of the corner of my eye. He paused for a brief moment, his gaze catching on me before he quickly turned and continued down the hall. The corners of my mouth curled into a smile. He noticed. Later that night, I changed into something casual but deliberate, soft shorts and a cropped tank top. It wasn't over the top, but it was enough to make an impression. When I walked into the living room, George was sitting on the couch, a book in his hands. He looked up briefly as I passed by, his eyes flicking to my legs before returning to his page. Didn't know you were still up, he said, his voice steady, though I noticed a slight pause before he spoke. I couldn't sleep, I replied, grabbing a throw blanket and sitting down on the other end of the couch. For a moment, there was only the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. I could feel his presence, the tension in the air that neither of us addressed. You're going to get cold dressed like that, he said after a while, his tone casual but his eyes sharp as they glanced at me. I shrugged, pulling the blanket loosely over my legs. I'm fine. It's warm enough. He nodded, his eyes lingering for a second longer than they should have before returning to his book. The next morning, I found another way to test him. While he was in the kitchen making coffee, I walked in barefoot, wearing an oversized shirt that just barely covered my shorts. Morning, I said, my voice light. Morning, he replied, glancing at me over his coffee mug. His gaze dropped to my legs for a split second before he turned back to the counter. I leaned against the kitchen island, pretending to look at my phone. What's the plan for today? He shrugged. Nothing special. Might do some yard work later. Do you need help? I asked, knowing full well that I had no intention of actually helping. His lips twitched into a small smile. You? Help with yard work? That's a first. I laughed softly, brushing the strand of hair behind my ear. Maybe I just want to spend some time outside. He raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, his attention returning to his coffee. That afternoon, I found him in the backyard, trimming the bushes along the fence. The sun was bright, and he'd taken off his shirt, leaving him in a pair of jeans and work boots. His skin glistened with sweat, and I couldn't help but stare for a moment before calling out to him. Need a hand? I asked, stepping onto the patio. He looked up, squinting against the sun. You're full of surprises this week, Scarlett. I shrugged, walking closer. Maybe I'm trying to be helpful. He chuckled, handing me a pair of gloves. All right, let's see what you've got. I worked beside him for a while, though I spent more time watching him than actually doing anything. Every so often, he'd glance at me, his expression unreadable. That evening, after dinner, I sat on the couch while George cleaned up in the kitchen. When he finally joined me, I shifted slightly to make room for him, pulling my legs up onto the couch. Long day? I asked, looking over at him. He leaned back, stretching his arm across the back of the couch. Productive. I noticed how his fingers brushed against the cushion near my shoulder, and my heart skipped a beat. Thanks for helping out today, he added, his tone softer. I smiled. You're welcome. It was kind of fun. He glanced at me then, his eyes meeting mine in a way that felt heavier than usual. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, but instead, he looked away, his jaw tightening. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moments we'd shared throughout the day. The way he looked at me, the subtle tension in his voice, it all felt like a game, one that I wasn't sure I was ready to stop playing. The line between us was becoming thinner, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. The next evening, Mom was still out, and George and I found ourselves alone again. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the television. He was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in his hand, and I decided to take a chance. I grabbed a throw blanket and sat down beside him, closer than usual. Close enough that our arms brushed lightly against each other. He didn't move, but I noticed the slight change in his posture, the way his hand tightened just a bit around the glass. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the tension between us thickening with every second. Finally, I broke it. George, I said, turning to look at him. You're always so serious. Don't you ever let yourself relax? He glanced at me, his lips curving into a faint smile. Someone in this family has to be serious. Your mom would lose her mind if I wasn't. I laughed softly, leaning a little closer. Maybe you should let loose every now and then. It might do you some good. He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused but cautious. And what exactly do you suggest, Scarlet. I shrugged, my fingers grazing his forearm as if by accident. His skin was warm under my touch, and I felt a thrill run through me when he didn't pull away. Start with this, I said lightly. Stop pretending you don't know how to have fun. He chuckled, a low sound that sent a shiver through me. But his expression turned serious as he leaned slightly closer, his gaze meeting mine. Scarlet, he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. You know this isn't a game, right? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe I don't want it to be a game. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might close the distance between us. But instead, he leaned back, exhaling deeply. You're playing with fire, he said, his tone both warning and intrigued. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of unspoken tension. Every time our hands brushed or our legs touched, my pulse quickened. I could feel his awareness of me, the way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. At one point, I got up to grab a drink, deliberately letting the blanket slip from my shoulders as I walked past him. When I returned, I caught him glancing at me before quickly turning his attention back to the TV. George, I said as I sat back down, this time even closer than before. He looked at me, his jaw tightening. What is it, Scarlet? You seem uncomfortable, I said, tilting my head slightly. He hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against his glass. You're imagining things. Am I? I challenged, my voice softer now. He didn't respond, but the way he looked at me spoke volumes. By the time we decided to call it a night, the air between us felt electric. As he stood to leave the room, he paused, looking back at me. Good night, Scarlet, he said, his voice steady but low. Good night, George, I replied, my eyes following him as he walked away. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way his voice deepened when he spoke to me, the way his gaze seemed to linger just a second too long, the way he didn't move away when I touched him. Something was happening, and it was bigger than either of us. I didn't know where it was headed, but I knew one thing, this wasn't over. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to hum in the air. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts tangled with everything that had happened over the past few days. The way George looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name, it all kept replaying in my mind. I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. The dim glow from the living room caught my attention, and I saw him sitting there, a glass of wine in his hand, staring into the darkness. You're not asleep? I asked softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, his gaze heavy and serious. Couldn't, he said simply. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down beside him on the couch. The air between us felt charged, thick with unspoken words. What's on your mind? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away, taking a slow sip of his wine before setting the glass down on the table. A lot of things, he finally said. Things I shouldn't be thinking about. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart pounding against my ribs. Like what? He turned to me then, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. You know what, he said, his voice low and deliberate. I leaned closer, my fingers brushing lightly against his on the couch. Why do you always pull away from me? Because I have to, he said, his jaw tightening. It's the right thing to do. Right for who? I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, but the way his eyes searched mine said everything he couldn't. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached up and touched my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin. Scarlet, he said, his voice barely audible. This is the point of no return. If you stay here, if you don't walk away, everything changes. I didn't move. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing briefly as his hand slid to the back of my neck. I'm not walking away, I said, my voice firm despite the fluttering in my chest. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. And then, his lips were on mine, warm and firm, sending a jolt of electricity through my entire body. The kiss deepened, and I felt his hands move to my waist, pulling me closer. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive under his touch, and I couldn't think of anything else, just him, just this moment. He broke the kiss briefly, his forehead resting against mine. "You don't know what you're doing to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then don't stop," I whispered, my hands sliding up his chest. His answer came in the form of another kiss, this one more urgent, more desperate. His fingers traced the curve of my back, sending shivers down my spine. The world outside ceased to exist. It was just us, tangled in each other, every touch, every kiss igniting something deeper. My hands moved of their own accord, exploring the planes of his shoulders, the warmth of his skin. I didn't know how far this would go, but I didn't care. In that moment, nothing else mattered. When we finally pulled apart, our breathing heavy, he looked at me with a mix of longing and regret. "Scarlett," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Do you understand what this means?" I nodded, my heart still racing. "I know," I said. "And I don't regret it." He exhaled, his hands still resting on my waist. "This changes everything." "I know," I repeated, leaning my forehead against his. That night, the line between us disappeared. What had once been unspoken tension became something tangible, something real. It happened. There was no going back, no undoing what we had done. And as I lay in his arms afterward, I knew that everything in my life had just shifted irrevocably. The weight of the moment settled over me, a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. And deep down, a part of me didn't want it to be. The morning after everything changed, I woke up with an unfamiliar hollowness inside me. The weight of what had happened hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt the burden of it. I lingered in bed, trying to make sense of my emotions. When I finally went downstairs, I found George at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and flipping through the newspaper as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," he said, glancing up briefly. His tone was calm, unreadable, as though the night before had been just another mundane evening. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. "Morning," I mumbled, grabbing a glass of water. I wanted to say something sharp, to cut through his indifferent facade. But the words wouldn't come. What had I expected? That everything would change, that he would be different? As the day went on, his demeanor didn't falter. He played his role flawlessly, the perfect husband, the calm presence in the house. And when Mom came home that evening, he greeted her with a smile, kissing her cheek as though nothing had happened. Watching them, I felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief. How could he act so effortlessly normal when my entire world had shifted? The days that followed were agonizing. George's composure didn't crack for a moment, and I began to wonder if I had imagined the weight of our shared night. But deep down, I knew the truth. The more I watched him, the more my anger grew. It wasn't just his indifference, it was his ability to carry on as though I didn't matter. Like I was nothing more than a passing moment, something to forget. That's when I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. If he thought he could just erase what had happened, he was wrong. One evening, when Mom was in the shower, I made my move. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter, angling it carefully so the camera would catch everything. I needed evidence, something undeniable. "George," I called, my voice deliberately sweet as I stepped into the room. He turned to me, his expression calm but cautious. "What is it, Scarlett?" I walked closer, letting a playful smile curl my lips. "You've been avoiding me," I said, tilting my head slightly. He frowned, setting down the glass of water he'd been holding. "I'm not avoiding you." I leaned against the counter, narrowing the space between us. "I think you are," I said softly. "Or have you already forgotten about our night?" His eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear behind his calm exterior. "Scarlett, stop," he said firmly. I ignored him, stepping closer. "Why? Are you afraid she'll find out?" Enough, he said, his voice low but tense. You don't understand what you're doing. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. At that moment, Mom entered the room, her hair wrapped in a towel. She froze, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene, George standing rigidly, his hand on the counter, and me leaning toward him, a little too close. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice sharp. I straightened, putting on an expression of mock innocence. Nothing, Mom. George and I were just talking. But the tension in the room was impossible to ignore, and I knew exactly how to push it further. I stepped away, brushing past George just enough for it to seem deliberate. He opened his mouth to speak, but Mom cut him off. Scarlett, go upstairs, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I obeyed, but not before catching the panic in George's eyes. From the top of the stairs, I listened as Mom's voice rose, her words sharp and accusatory. What the hell was that, George? She demanded. Linda, it's not what it looks like, he said, his voice steady but strained. Then what is it? She shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've crossed a line with my daughter. I didn't, he said quickly. She's been difficult lately. I was trying to set boundaries. Boundaries? Mom interrupted, her voice rising. You think that excuses what I just saw? There was a pause, and I could almost hear George struggling to maintain his composure. You don't understand, he said finally. No, Mom snapped. You don't understand. Pack your things and get out of my house. Now. By the time I heard the front door slam, the weight in my chest had begun to lift. I'd won. George was gone, and Mom would never look at him the same way again. But as I lay in bed that night, the triumph felt hollow. What had I really accomplished? I'd driven him away, but the memory of what we'd shared remained, etched into my mind. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that he deserved it. But deep down, a small, shameful part of me wondered if I'd regret it. And as much as I wanted to believe I could move on, I knew this wasn't the end. George left that very night. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house, leaving a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. For a moment, I sat at the top of the stairs, listening to the stillness, unsure if I felt relief or regret. I should have felt victorious. I had won, hadn't I? But instead, I felt hollow. Mom tried to move on as if nothing had happened, but the tension lingered. She asked questions, probing gently at first, then more insistently. Scarlett, did George ever say anything to you? Or do something that made you uncomfortable? She asked one evening, her voice hesitant but firm. I shook my head, forcing a smile. No, Mom. He was just George. She studied me for a moment, her eyes searching for something I wasn't ready to give her. It's just. You seemed so close before, and now. I'm fine, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. It's better this way. She didn't press further, but I could tell she didn't believe me. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I didn't need to guess who it was. You think you've won, don't you? I stared at the words, my stomach twisting. Before I could decide whether to respond, another message appeared. You'll regret crossing me, Scarlett. I deleted the messages, but they stayed with me, the words looping in my mind like a bad song. I told myself it didn't matter, that George was gone and couldn't hurt me anymore. But deep down, I wasn't sure that was true. A week passed before I heard from him again. This time, the message was shorter but no less haunting. You can hate me all you want, but you'll never forget what we had. He was right. I wouldn't forget. But that didn't mean I would let him control me. I blocked the number and turned off my phone, but the memories lingered. The things we'd done, the line we'd crossed, it was all burned into my mind, a constant reminder of how close I had come to losing myself. Mom never found out the full truth. She started rebuilding her life, finding strength in her independence. I admired her for that, even as I struggled to do the same. I told myself that what had happened with George would stay buried, a secret I would take to my grave. It was a lesson, one I never wanted to repeat, but also a burden I would carry forever. There were moments when I wondered if I had been too reckless, if I had played with fire and gotten exactly what I deserved. But other times, I reminded myself that I had survived, that I had come out stronger. Now, as I tell you this story, I want you to understand one thing. Never play with fire if you're not ready to get burned. Because sometimes, the scars are the only thing you're left with.